Jeff Kofman is the CEO and founder of Trint, an AI-powered transcription software company. But before that, he spent over 3 decades as an Emmy Award-winning foreign and war correspondent, reporting from over 40 countries on some of the biggest events of our time. But what makes him such a great guest for the Rhizomes podcast isn't just where he's been, it's what he's learned. In our conversation, we talk about resilience, empathy, the overlaps between entrepreneurship and journalism, and what it takes to make a huge life change. I learned so much from speaking with Jeff. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I appreciate your support. You spent more than 30 years as a reporter, and I'm wondering what kept you engaged in that profession for so long.
I was one of those lucky people who found the career that was just a perfect fit. Creativity, curiosity, compassion, an idealistic belief that uh, we as citizens in a democracy are better if we understand what the context is, and reporters' roles are to help people, inform people so they can be better, they can make more informed decisions and be better equipped as citizens. And so there's a kind of idealism in there, but the creativity of storytelling is enormous in journalism, particularly as you get into longer form. Um, and the curiosity, I'm afflicted, I like to say, by curiosity. It's a nice problem to have, but it's, I'm just insatiably curious about people, about research, about context, about history, about the world. And so, for me, it was really a great fit, and I have a lot of energy, which you need, by the way, to be a reporter, and certainly to be a network correspondent. It's really taxing. It's hard. There are elements of it for sure that are glamorous, but it's a lot of hard work, long days, exhausting, it's often uncomfortable travel. So you pay for it, but wow, yeah, I feel very, very grateful that I found that career, and had a really, really good run. 30 years, 33 years, I think it was. It's a pretty wholesome run.
Yeah, I mean, sounds like an incredible journey. And even though it's one career, it sounds like it was so, you had such diverse experiences within those over 30 years. And I was wondering, you mentioned energy and it taking a toll on you in certain ways. Were there any junctures throughout your career where you considered pivoting or quitting?
Um, I think that it's a funny thing when when you've had a kind of a reasonably high profile career and you've had some real success. Um, People look at my sort of my resume on paper, so to speak, and go, "Oh wow, look, you just went from, local TV in Canada to, having your own." I started as a local reporter in Toronto, then had my own show at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, where I was co-host, and then became a reporter and anchor, and then national reporter, and then backed up the national newscast in Canada, hosted. I was backup host for the hugely influential morning radio program in Canada. I just had a really interesting and kind of terrifying beginning to my career. I mean, the number of times I felt like I was an imposter. I remember thinking, they're going to tell me not to come back tomorrow. And they didn't. So I just kept showing up. And I think the truth is that if you keep trying, you do get better and you learn, hopefully. And I'm really grateful that YouTube didn't exist when I was in my early years in broadcast, because I think there were some pretty bad pieces. And I'm glad that they're lost on videotape somewhere in a shelf somewhere
Yeah.
that nobody's going to find. I mean, there's nothing scandalous. It's just I don't think I was a very good. My read wasn't good. My nervousness came through, and all of those things. And nowadays, it's pretty unforgiving. But
Mhm.
to answer your question, you get tested all the time. It is. I like to say that when I made it from CBC in Canada to CBS Evening News in New York in 1997, the journalism wasn't the hard part, so to speak. I mean, it's challenging and it is hard, but I think that being a national correspondent for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation really trained me to do the journalism, which is presumably why they hired me. The politics of those networks, nothing prepares you for that. I
Mhm.
mean, you need such resilience, you need such fortitude, the kind of competitiveness, the capriciousness, uh, when they call it the news business, news is in lowercase, business is in capitals in boldface, and it's even more pronounced now. But that took quite a lot of getting used to, and really tested me. And there were moments when I thought, I don't know, I'm not sure. But I think what I learned was just keep going. And I think the rewards of the career are so enormous that it's I think reporters allow themselves the kind of inconveniences, he says politely,
Mm.
of that life. And I mean, one of the things that does wear you, it sounds like maybe indulgent, but is that you're always on call when you're, for me as a reporter, um, no matter where you are. When I was in Miami for ABC News for 10 years, covering Florida, Latin America, Southern US, when I was off on the weekend, when I was away with friends, I had my phone with me. I had my passport with me. And they could call and say, hey, X has happened in New Orleans, or Y has happened in Caracas. There's a plane. You need to be on it. And I would be. And
Mhm.
it was like, I mean, I to the point where, you have friends coming over or friends visiting from out of town, and you go, guys, there's food in the fridge. I don't know when I'll be back. And that doesn't happen all the time, but it happens with enough regularity that you kind of stop having expectations about having a life.
Mhm.
Um, and so, it does take a toll, but the dividend is you just see and do the most interesting things and have the most fascinating challenges. And, I think I would say that, the money and the fame go to the anchors, but the really interesting, rewarding work in journalism goes to the field reporters. And I know I'd like to think I figured that out pretty early. I loved being in the field. It was
Mm.
really, really fascinating. And covering Latin America for 10 years. I mean, what a privilege. I mean, it's an area that's so underreported and so fascinating and, full of complex history and problems. But to see it up close and to try to understand it, to do both serious stories on the problems of cocaine production in Colombia or Chavez at the time in Venezuela, and then really exotic documentaries on environmental protection in the Galapagos, or the discovery of an unexpected pod of hundreds of whales in Patagonia and Chile. I mean, I turned to my producer more than once and said, this is so thrilling, so fascinating. I can't believe I'm being paid to be here. It is so absolutely, all, you know, encompassing, and uh, it just was so thrilling and
Mhm.
so interesting. And the challenge then is to capture that in a story. So, were there times? Absolutely. And I think, being a war correspondent really, really tests that. You do learn to kind of uh, compartmentalize the fear, the horror that you see, and to sort of just keep going. I didn't choose to be a war correspondent. I think when 9/11 happened, all of us were called into duty in ways we hadn't really expected, and um, I found myself in uh, all sorts of places that I never expected to be. But as someone who really believes in, maybe I'm old fashioned, but I just really do believe these stories need to be told. I
Mhm.
thought, I said to myself, you signed up for this. These are important stories. I don't mind doing fun pieces, but it's not what I signed up to do. And so I know I did it, and I'd like to think I got good at it. I pretty confident that I got good at it. I
Mm.
did some work that I look at today. I'm pretty critical of my work, but when I teach, when I do some university lecturing, I pull out some of my own stories and I go, that piece worked. There's some good writing there. There's some good storytelling. It's not just another story by another reporter. And um, so uh, the war work does take a toll, and I think that it's probably was one of the reasons I was okay moving on. I just felt like I'd done enough of it, and I'm okay that I'm not okay that my friends have been in Ukraine and Gaza and Syria, but I'm okay that it's not me,
Mhm.
and I'm fine watching them report. I worry about them, and I worry
Mhm.
about, and I have huge empathy for the people involved and the citizens of those countries, because I've been there. Just as we're recording this, Syria has just had a change of leadership, and I'm watching the news from Damascus of the looting of Assad's palace.
Mhm.
I saw those exact same images when uh, Muammar Gaddafi fell in 2011 in Tripoli. I was there, and you could almost have run my footage in that
Yeah.
story. And the same thing happened in what 2003 was it, when Saddam fell.
Mhm.
So I know I've experienced it, and I had this sense of deja vu when I watched that footage this week.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. Actually, when I was researching your work and I read extensively about your work with the Arab Spring and your work in Libya, and I saw the news concurrently, I thought you must be, plugged into this, and you're probably in a good position to draw some comparisons between, the different events. But yeah, I mean, hearing you talk about the diversity within your career and also all the challenges that your career entailed is really fascinating. And particularly, you said something that stuck with me, that you empathize with the people who are currently in these different places. And I'm curious what your reporting career taught you about empathy.
Um, I think it's a good question. No one's ever asked me that in many interviews. I think that it's taught me that people don't fall within a caricature, and that um, this side isn't good and this side bad. I think that what you understand is that even the soldiers for the quote bad side unquote are not all bad people. They're people who just got conscripted. They're 18-year-old kids who were told you're going into the Iraqi, uh, Syrian, Libyan army, and you're fighting for the dictator. They don't really have a choice. And so that doesn't mean that they're all bad people. There are definitely bad people amongst them. I think that the other thing is that, you know, I would never say you want to cover a war, you want to be in a war zone. It's obviously hugely stressful, and it's hard and sometimes awful and horrible. But you do learn about the human condition in ways that you probably don't in any other form. And I think what I saw uh, in places like Iraq and Libya, uh, and even in the revolutions in Venezuela, for example, in Haiti, is that we in the 21st century have a unbelievably pampered life in the West. And we turn on the water and it's hot. We turn on the water, it's cold. We turn the switch on and the lights go on. We just assume that all of these conveniences in our in our kitchens and elsewhere are just part of life. But what you see, and hospitals are there, by the way, should you get injured, should a loved one get injured,
Hmm.
and police are here to keep order. I think that what I saw in war zones and what I saw in places of extreme poverty is that people are able to tolerate life with far less. They are far more resilient than we believe. And I wouldn't suggest that any of us want to be tested, but sometimes you see those disaster movies from Hollywood where oh, the power goes off and suddenly people in the suburbs have to survive with no electricity.
Hmm.
Well, that's actually what happens in a war zone,
Yeah.
and people figure out how to do it. And I think when you ask about empathy, uh, I saw ordinary people regularly do extraordinary things to protect their families, to feed their families, to protect their neighborhoods, to keep life moving. And I think it gave me a sense of what it's like to be just the little person in a big conflict.
Hmm.
You just try to get by and make sure that the people who you love and the people who you care about, the people around you, can get by too, which is really hard, particularly when you're dealing with very old people who suffer terribly in war zones. and also with babies, obviously, who need
Yeah.
nutrition and support. Those are the two extremes of life. I would say pay hard, and people with disability, people that can be really heartbreaking. That it's a real struggle for people who are severely disabled when
Hmm.
in those countries normally it's hard, but in a war and conflict, uh, it becomes untenable.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like those insights on empathy are invaluable and probably very hard to obtain in ordinary life.
Let me tell you a story actually about that. Now it reminds me. I remember once I'd come back from Iraq, and I was living in Miami. I was an ABC News correspondent in Miami, and I don't know why I was flying through Philadelphia, but I was connecting. I was connecting in Philadelphia, and it was one of those really stormy days with lightning, and all the flights were delayed, and the airport was chock a block. There were no seats. People were sitting on the floor, and my flight was delayed. And I have no patience for people who complain about flight delays in those circumstances. It's just life. It's nobody's fault. The airline and the woman behind the counter, they're not responsible. Lightning
Mhm.
happens, planes can't fly, deal with it. Just
Yeah.
read a book, play a game, do something. And I remember I had been back from Iraq not very many days, and I'm sitting there thinking, I don't know if my flight's going to take off. And this old man turns to his wife and says, "This is the worst day of my life." And
Yeah.
I heard myself say, unfiltered, "Sir, I guess you've had a pretty good life then."
Yeah.
And he turned beet red and turned away, and we didn't exchange another word. And I but it's true. I was just thought, wow, man, you have no perspective. I know we all have bad days, but in the
Mhm.
scale of bad days, a delayed flight just doesn't count. And I think that when you've seen the kind of things that people in my job have seen, it really gives you a perspective on stuff like that. Really,
Mhm.
I of course I don't like flight delays any more than you do, but I'm not going to yell at the person behind the counter. And candidly, I'm embarrassed when people do, and I have more than once said, "Sir, she's just working here. Could you just ease up on her?"
Mhm.
Because I get really really frustrated when people lose perspective about stuff and have the kind of smugness about the entitlement of life that sometimes we see around.
Mhm.
I think it's really put in perspective when you've seen real hardship and poverty.
Absolutely. Would you say that perspective fades away over time as you're more and more removed from that part
Not
of
for
your
me.
career? Okay.
No, not at all. No, I would say not at all. I think it's raw.
Mhm.
I covered the revolution in Haiti in Port-au-Prince in 2004 and was there for 6 or 8 weeks when Jean Bertrand Aristide was overthrown by guerrillas. And I spent time in Cité Soleil, which is Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and Cité Soleil is this the uh, it's a slum. There isn't a polite word for it. It is just the poorest, saddest place I've ever been on earth,
Mhm.
really. And I went in there to look at uh, how people were surviving, and they were selling little patties of mud with a little bit of cooking oil on them. They had no nutritional value. They were selling them for the equivalent of a penny for mothers to feed their starving children. And they had no nutritional value. They were just to fill the bellies. Uh, and when you see that, you just don't forget that stuff. I mean, that is seared in my memory, those
Yeah.
images and that sense of despair and the scale of it, because they say, I don't remember, there are a million people in Cité Soleil. I mean, the scale of it is just immense.
Mhm.
And the stench, I felt like such a, I, I, I felt I was so uh, out of place there. This wealthy, by their standards, U.S. network correspondent and his crew, and you're holding your nose, but you don't want to be seen to be doing it because it smelled so bad.
Yeah.
And these children following you in ragged clothes, and I looked around, and there was one girl eating on something and pulling it, and I realized it was a used condom, and it was like,
Oh,
oh my
wow.
god! And I just, your heart, you just that sense of you're kidding me.
Mhm.
And so, no, I don't think you forget images like that. It's just, it is is so searing to see that kind of existence. And I would say that Albert Einstein could be born in Cité Soleil and he would never make something of his life. There's just almost no opportunity to to raise yourself up in a place like that. I don't forget that.
For you to get that perspective, your career put you in extreme situations, and through that, you came out with this kind of perspective. How do you give the ordinary person perspective, and how do you kind of scale those sentiments that you bring back from your life so that other people might have, additional understanding of what it means to actually have a miserable day?
You know, it's a good question. What you can't do is people don't want to be told what to think. That's a fundamental of life and certainly a fundamental of journalism. If you try to, I think it's a real problem in a lot of the journalism that we're seeing today from any perspective. Um, People want to be given information and allowed to come to their own conclusion. And I think too much journalism is they're bad, they're good. If you're not with the good people, then you're a bad person. And I think that that's really helping create the polarized societies of America and other countries. Um, how do I'm struggling to answer your question because I think it's a very good one. And I think you have to, I think I have to filter. I'll tell you, here's another example. I've never done cocaine. I've never tasted it. I, of course, or snorted it. I just never been interested. I have friends who have. I mean, it's not, that's no surprise. I did pieces for ABC News on cocaine production in Colombia and saw where it comes from and saw what it does. The campesinos, the peasants who grow it and harvest it, who are just trying to get enough money to pay for their children to go to school, buy them some clothes, get them some books, which is not very much money in Colombia, but school's not free and books
Mm-hmm.
aren't free. And you can't, in the fields where they grow coca, they could grow coffee or bananas, but they'd get one crop a year. Coca, they get 3. And that's the economics of coca for very, very poor people in places like Colombia. And then I went with the Colombian military on U.S. Black Hawk helicopters when they were blowing up coca paste labs that create the kind of toothpaste, which is the base product of cocaine. And it's made with sulfuric acid, gasoline, and a few other components. Those things end up in the rivers of Colombia and kill the rivers.
Wow.
The campesinos who harvest the coca leaves have to do it with bare hands, and they're sharp and they cut their hands. And so for me, it's cocaine consumption is a real moral question. And I sometimes struggle not to lecture people about it and say, you may think this is really, hot shit cool because you can do this and feel great. I've seen where it comes from and the price people pay as the poor people who harvested this for you, and the rivers that you say you care about the environment. Well, guess what's gone into the river to produce that cocaine for you?
Mm-hmm.
It's sulfuric acid, which is killing the rivers literally, and you can see it in the jungles. And it's for me, it's quite difficult because I have to choose my moments, and it's not easy to know when that conversation is welcome and when it's not. And sometimes I have to bite my lip. It's just, I don't really want to, in the middle of a conversation with someone I've just met, go, no, I don't do it, and here's why. And nor should you. So that's a really interesting. I still struggle with that. But I find it difficult not to have some judgment. But that's life. You just have to kind of find a way to make peace with that.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because neither extreme is effective. If I were to reflect, you have such valuable insights from a unique experience. You don't want to suppress sharing what you learned, but on the other hand, you also don't want to necessarily lecture or enforce certain opinions. So finding that balance is probably important and difficult.
I have used it. I have told some of that story when, for example, when I've talked to high school kids about my career, and I say, listen, at some point you may have the option of using cocaine. Let me just tell you what I saw. So if you're going to use it, it's your business, not mine. But don't go telling yourself that, by the way, I care about the environment and it really matters that we worry about the ozone and all of that stuff, because that cocaine just killed, is killing rivers and enslaving people. So
Mhm.
there's nothing about the consumption of cocaine that isn't, against all those nice things that you may believe. So,
Mhm.
I have, I haven't done it quite in such a heavy lecturing way, I hope,
Mhm.
but I think there are moments I have been able to bring up that learning. You just have to be selective.
Mhm. Absolutely. Cool. Yeah. Slightly different area that I'd like to discuss. So I read one of your LinkedIn posts where you refer to the Chilean mine rescue as the most amazing story in your 30-year career as a reporter. So for those who aren't familiar, before asking you more specific questions, could you briefly describe the mine rescue?
So it was the summer of 2010, and I was based in Miami, and as part of I covered sort of southern U.S., Caribbean, Latin America, and I would read the papers and the wires from Latin America kind of on a kind of regular basis just to know what's going on. And I remember, I think it was the beginning of August, I read a dispatch from probably on one of the wires saying that a mine had collapsed in the Atacama Desert in northern Chile, uh, and 33 miners were trapped underground. And I remember saying to myself, well, this won't make it on ABC World News or Good Morning America. It's an industrial accident. It's sad. I kind of assumed that that they'd say that they'd given up and they were assumed dead. And I went on holiday home to Canada to see my family. And I was driving to the airport in Toronto, I remember. It was late August, and I was flying to New York for meetings, and I had a BlackBerry, I think then, didn't have an iPhone. I remember it vibrating, and I kind of broke the rule and looked, and it said 33 miners found alive after 17 days trapped underground. They're still half a mile underground. And I got on, put my earpiece in, responsible driving, called New York, got the foreign editor at home. It was a Sunday. And I said, Tom, we talk about miracles. This is amazing. These guys have been underground with almost no food for 17 days and they're all alive. We got to go. And there was a lot of back and forth. And anyway, I ended up going down. I was the first reporter to make it down there, beyond the Chilean and Argentine reporters. Arrived in Santiago, filed a story Monday for World News, flew up 800 kilometers north to Copiapó, which was the closest airport, drove through the night, arrived, I think it was 2 or 3 in the morning, at Camp Esperanza, Camp Hope, where the families had been camped out at the gates of this really old mine to pressure uh, the rescuers to keep going. And what unfolded were 7 of the most fascinating weeks of my life. Um, it was this combination of the drive of the families, the dedication of the rescuers, the complexities of the rescue. They had used a coring. They knew that they were probably in a refuge at the very bottom of this, what they call a corkscrew mine. This was a gold and copper mine that didn't have a shaft where they go in an elevator. They would go in electric vehicles down this a corkscrew half a mile underground, and that road was a couple of miles long. I don't remember how long, but it would take quite a long time to get to the bottom. They were drilling core drills down to try to find the refuge, to see if they kind of knew where it was, but they didn't have any GPS. And after, I think it was 17 days, they found everything about the story was extraordinary. Uh, when they were rescued, when they were found, the Chilean rescue teams already had what they called palomas, pigeons, which were just pipes. They had stomach medication and nutrients for these miners because they'd been starving, which means that if you if you sent them an energy bar, it would kill them because they were so malnourished that their bodies couldn't break it up. You have to send them liquids and powders or gels. All of that was ready. They had a rope ready. The moment they found them, they lowered these things down. They had 33 doses of stomach medication. They had bottles of water. They were ready. And I remember interviewing some experts at NASA who were consulted about this. And I said, what did you learn about this? And they said, we couldn't tell them anything. They'd already figured it all out. And
Wow.
it was just this story of endless ingenuity, thoughtfulness, uh, and resilience on a level rarely seen. Um, a few days into the rescue, they were living in 90% humidity. They had fungus on their bodies. They had no light. And for the 17 days, their electric lights were dying. They had 2 days of supplies. They were living on a couple of cans of tuna and some condensed milk, which their foreman said they could have one spoonful of each every other day. He said, we've got to make this last. And that caused a lot of dissension, but it's what kept them alive, probably, uh, because he was able to stretch it out over more than 2 weeks. Then they had to figure out how to get them out. And they had drills from Australia, Canada, and the US, drill teams with 3 different technologies. And it was, for 7 weeks, I was reporting on it. It was like a competition to see who could drill a shaft big enough to get a capsule down to put the men in to bring them up. And they kept hitting mine debris that was breaking the drill bits. And the stories were extraordinary, of the kind of global cooperation on a level never seen before. I remember I flew out with the head of logistics for FedEx after the rescue, and he sat beside me in the airplane, and he said, "I can't believe what I just saw happen." He said, "In my 20 or 30-year career, I've never seen people move mountains the way they did for this." He said, "We had a point where the drill team from Australia broke the last drill bit they had in the Atacama Desert. The only one that was left was in the Australian outback. A plane was chartered to take it to Sydney. Qantas delayed its flight." I get emotional hearing these stories. I find these stories so powerful. Qantas delayed its flight to Los Angeles. LAN Airways Chile delayed its flight from LA to Santiago. I think the Chilean military had a plane waiting to take it from Santiago up to the closest airport in Copiapó, and then a truck brought it in from Copiapó. He said, we got it there in something like 36 hours. He said, maybe it was 48, but he said, there wasn't an extra minute in the clock. He said, there's no way that is a weeks-long journey, reasonably. But he said the entire world was prepared to stop what it was doing to make sure that drill got to those people so they could be rescued.
Wow.
And the stories like that just kept happening. And so I just found that it was this conjunction of so many different elements of the human condition. And I think it was one of the rare moments in my very long career where there was no bad guy. I mean, the owners of the mine, you could argue, were the bad guys, but they were pushed aside by the Chilean government. They immediately took over the search operations. In the actual rescue operation, you had the entire world cooperating with technologies. The rope that wouldn't spin the capsule was made in Austria and was flown in, so that, because if it spun for half a mile coming up, they'd get sick and it would be lethal. So they had to have a non-spinning rope. I mean, who knew about that kind of stuff? But all of these elements, you had this global story of cooperation on a scale that was, the entire world was mesmerized by it. It was the biggest spot news story of its kind in history. When I arrived, there were maybe 15 or 20 journalists from Chile and Argentina at the mine. On the day of the rescue, there were more than 3,000 in the middle of the driest desert in the world.
Wow.
This camp came up. So for me, it was fascinating. And it was this endless drama of, it was a real life story of, can they, will they, how's it going to happen? And they did. They got them all up. They came up alive. Sadly, some of them were emotionally damaged by the trauma of 33 days in darkness, or 17 days of starvation, and then 10 weeks it took them 7 weeks, I think, to rescue them. So it was a very long time underground. They were able to pump air down to, they put 2 other shafts down, and they put electricity down. They had a tiny little camera so they could watch soccer games, and They sent them little cots that would fit in the boreholes. It just took them a very long time to drill a hole a half mile down in the debris of a collapsed mine uh, to get a capsule in that could bring them up. But yeah, it was an extraordinary story, and when I look on it, it was the conjunction of every element of storytelling in one.
Yeah, wow. That's phenomenal. And I'm curious, it sounds that in each one of these, experiences in your career or stories, you can get really emotionally invested. Obviously, intellectually invested, you have to really learn new things all the time. But from an emotional perspective, you connect to a story, you connect to the people, and then it's done, and then you have another assignment. I'm not really sure chronologically if that's how it works, but I'm just curious from your perspective, how do you deal with that kind of intensity of emotion of, learning about something entirely new, connecting to the story, connecting to the people, and then some period of time later having to do that all over again and then scale that over multiple decades? What are some behaviors or habits that help you deal with that kind of, emotional intensity?
You're asking some good questions. I think that um, I don't think you can be a good journalist if you don't allow yourself to feel. I think uh, I think if you're so clinical and so focused on how your hair is, and whether your makeup's right, and whether your shirt's straight, and you don't think about the people you're talking to, you're just a machine. You're a celebrity. You're not a reporter. You're not a journalist. I'm not ashamed of feeling something for the people I've met.
Mhm.
I can think of three distinct moments in my career when I actually cried. I didn't show it on camera, but
Mhm.
I remember them because they're seared in my memory. Uh, and actually, the Chile mine rescue was one of them. It's a little bit like what I said about covering war. I would never say, "Gee, you should cover war. It's fascinating," because war is terrible. But I do think you learn. I didn't start these wars. I didn't create the mine collapse. Reporters are simply there to chronicle what's happened in the world, and I think you have to allow yourself to have empathy. I think you just have to be careful. I think there are moments when it's fine to show that empathy, and I think the families of the miners underground, there's no shame in saying, in talking about the heartbreak that they're enduring. Uh, I think there are times, though, when you just have to really say, am I letting my emotions color the story in a way that is sl- changing the tone of the story, and pushing people to think something?
Mhm.
And clearly about politics, about volatile issues. Abortion is a story, for example. You have to, I think it's you're never going to cover that story. I covered it during some of the the shootings at abortion clinics, and uh, you're never going to cover that story and satisfy every viewer. All you can do uh, is try to be fair and try to understand whatever you think. You want to give people the information so that whatever their perspective, they feel that you're informing them. And I
Mhm.
think you have to be really careful in moments like that, not to tell people what to think or what you think, but to give them the information. And to, I don't like the word truth. Whenever someone says, Mr. Kofman, I'm going to tell you the truth, I bristle, because that means I'm going to tell you my truth. And if you don't
Mhm.
agree with me, you're a liar. I think I think that I know what fairness is. I know what integrity is. I know what misrepresenting someone is. And I think that in stories like uh, the shooting in an abortion clinic, you have to really put those filters on your journalism and say, am I being fair? Am I being, am I representing this person in a way that speaks of their perspective uh, fairly and honestly, and doesn't caricature them, doesn't sort of look for the single moment when they slip and say something.
Mhm.
And was that moment the truth? I use the word truth, but was that moment more honest, or was that moment uh, just a misspeaking? You have to make those judgment calls, and there is no guidebook beyond instinct, beyond talking to your colleagues, beyond bouncing concerns off your editors in New York and saying, here are the things that he said. I think this is what we should do, what I want to say, but do you think that's fair? There are ways to balance these things. I
Hmm.
think, though, showing empathy, there's no shame in showing empathy. But I also hate seeing people who get it really sappy and that kind of Hallmark Christmas movie kind of emotions in a story. I think that that's just overkill.
Hmm. Yeah, it sounds like a really difficult balance to find, but it's cool to hear your perspective on that. And I mean, speaking of big shifts, whether it's between assignments and types of work, you're no longer a reporter today. You're a founder and CEO of an artificial intelligence company. How'd that happen?
I ask myself that question every morning when I get up. What was I thinking? Um, my company Trint was 10 years old on December 1st, 2024. If you had told me a dozen years ago, Jeff, you're going to leave journalism, you're going to go into tech, you're going to invent software that doesn't exist, and you are going to build a company uh, that has sales around the world, that is used by the major news organizations and corporations to transcribe, to translate, to collaborate on content creation in ways that were impossible a dozen years ago. I would have said, you're dreaming in Technicolor. That's never going to happen. I would have given you very favorable odds, and I would have owed you a lot of money because I just didn't see it coming. I kind of stumbled into it. I think that what happened was I transferred from Miami to London at the end of 2010. I was promoted to a London correspondent for ABC News and covered the Arab Spring in 2011. I think that I was in my 50s and I'd done it for a very long time. And I started to feel that the drift away from serious news was happening in a way that was making me grumpy. And I don't think that I was being paid to be grumpy. And in between doing serious stories, I'm not a believer that every story has to be serious. To be clear, I'm happy to do stories on eccentric French cheesemakers. They don't do that kind of stuff anymore, but they're still fun, and the cheese is good. But I'm less interested in kind of celebrity stories or cruise ships that have lost their air conditioning kind of stories. And there was more and more of that happening. And I just kind of realized I'm probably not. I used to think if I didn't die in the newsroom and they didn't carry me out feet first, that my career wouldn't be a success. I think that that's kind of the uh, naivete of youthfulness. And I think that as I got older, I realized maybe somebody else should start doing some of this stuff because I'm not sure I want to keep doing those same stories. And so I took a buyout from ABC News. Wasn't really sure what I was going to do, but I had a long lead time. Was teaching university, started working on a book proposal, and kind of stumbled into meeting some developers because of my university teaching. I was doing an overseas journalism program for Indiana University, a summer program on 21st century journalism or journalism of the 21st century. And a friend said, "Oh, you should come to MozFest and see. It's an open source coding conference in London where media innovation is showcased." I'm sure I'd met developers before then, but I'd never met developers and talked to them about writing code before. It's a pretty intimidating crowd to walk into when you see all of this stuff on the wall, and I felt like I'd gone to a conference of Greek linguists, and
Yeah.
but I met some developers who had done something with audio and text, and I said, just offhand, why do I have to keep transcribing my interviews when speech to text is almost useful? And I remember this quirky Romanian developer saying to me, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, I spend my life transcribing my interviews, the speeches I cover, the news conferences. It's the biggest pain in the ass of my job. And it takes up a huge amount of time for anybody in my job. And whether it's in print or radio or TV, whether you're a producer or a reporter or an editor, it's just life. You got to listen to your in my case, my interview, my videotape, and write down what's said or type out what's said so you can write your story around the actual words. And it's incredibly time consuming. And we kind of knocked our heads together, some of these people, these guys who I'd met, and kept in touch. And I sent them an audio of a interview that I'd done, an audio file, and described what I wanted to do. And a few weeks later, we got on Skype and they shared it, and it was amazing. And I said, I think we've just invented the future. Hmm. And if we don't do this, someone else is going to. And so that's what I did. I ended up building Trint, and I had no idea. To build a tech company when you have no experience in business, in tech, in management, in finance, you need a couple of qualities. You need to be incredibly humble about what you don't know, but you need to be very overconfident in a weird way. I call it humble overconfidence. It's about resilience. It's about admitting what you don't know and getting help, and it's about picking yourself up when you make mistakes, because I've made a lot of them. And when people say no and slam the door and say, I'm not giving you money, I don't believe it, I don't think you can do it. It's so you need that kind of overconfidence or resilience to keep going. And you need to be a bit naive. I don't think I realized how hard it was going to be and how much of my life would be dedicated to building Trint into a viable company. But it turns out that without really thinking, and I left ABC News November 30th, 2014, and started working on Trint December 1st, 2014, literally 12 hours later. And it turns out that I set myself this fantastic challenge that has been so exciting, so hard, as I've said, but also rewarding and often fun. Life is about the journey more than the destination. And this has been an amazing journey for someone like me. It's this complete 180. I had to learn everything. The one thing I understood was the problem that needed to be solved, and it turns out that's the fundamental of any innovation. I had to learn all the other stuff. I remember the first time I was out fundraising, and this woman said to me, "So show me your KPIs." I honestly didn't really know what KPIs were. And I had sort of turned my MacBook away from her and Googled them. And I said, well, we're working on our key performance indicators, and we'll get them to you. I'll have them in a couple of weeks. And I called up a friend who was a CFO, and I said, what do I do? I have no effing idea how to answer her question. And he said, let's get together for coffee. I'll help you. And he helped me build this incredibly crude model that I don't even know where that is now, but it was a start. And that's kind of how it began. It was just this kind of duct tape and paperclip origin story.
So just for the listeners, we got a little technical bug, so we had to pause. But I'll just pick us back up from where we were, and I'll move on to like a similar question. You described some of the qualities or some of the abilities that starting a company requires, and you mentioned naivete as one of them, and willingness to understand a problem and to learn new things. I also imagine that starting a company requires endurance, and any major career switch would also require a lot of energy. So where do you get your energy from?
So I'm going to tell you a little secret I don't tell very many people. I'm 65.
Wow.
I just did the hardest. I'm a road cyclist, and I just did the hardest road cycle of my life in September.
Wow.
It's called the Ride Across Britain, and it starts in Land's End, Cornwall, which is the far southwest of Cornwall, goes all the way up to the top of Scotland, to John O'Groat, Scotland. It's 1,000 miles. It is some days were more than 3,000 meters, 3,000 yards of climbing. It was a hell of a hard ride. It was 110 miles a day. And I trained for it for 8 months. And there were moments in that ride when I really thought, you idiot, you've taken on something that's too hard. It was really tough. It's an event, and there were 800 cyclists. It was very well organized. You went from base camp to 2 pit stops at 1/3, 2/3, and the end of each day. And there were some brutal climbs, and it was just 110 miles, 9 days. That's 9 marathons in a row. I mean, it's on a bike, and it just took resilience. It really, an interesting life takes resilience. That's the bottom line. My first career as a journalist, resilience. When they rescued those miners in Chile, we went 4 days with almost no sleep. I think I counted 5 hours in 4 days. My body eventually shut down and said, enough.
Mhm.
The day after the mine rescue, I lost my voice, and I flew to Santiago, locked myself in the hotel for 3 or 4 days, and slept. Uh, and that it took resilience to go through day after day. But Good Morning America, World News, Nightline wanted that story, and there was just no time to sleep. And it was so exciting and so interesting. I found the energy. That happened I remember when Gaddafi was overthrown in 2011. Same kind of conditions. We were not staying in a very comfortable place, but the story was so important, and the demand for it was so big. And I was the only reporter for ABC News in Libya, so I was on morning news and noon and night, or morning, evening, and night, and late night, day after day. And you have more in you than you think you do. And I guess I proved that yet again when I did the ride across Britain and hit these walls of fatigue and despair, when I thought, I'm 80 miles into this and I got another 30 to go. I don't know if I can do it. And I had these conversations with myself, and I said, you idiot, why have you done this? And I remember sort of saying, legs, you're not part of this conversation. You just keep pedaling. And I made it, and I did it. And crossing that finish line on September 15th, 2024 was one of the most euphoric days of my life. I was close to tears because I wanted to challenge myself at this stage, on sort of at having hit this milestone. I wanted to see if I could really take on a big challenge and achieve it, and I did. So I think listen. I say to people, you can have an easy life or you can have an interesting life. I'm much more interested in an interesting life, but if you want an interesting life, you got to work for it. You've got to want it, and you've got to deal with obstacles put in your way and find how to get over them and around them. And those are the choices. I think that having an interesting life, if you're lucky enough to grow up in a world that gives you the freedom to explore your curiosity, your passion, it's a great way to live. But it's, you do need resilience, and you test yourself. And the thing about testing yourself in life is that when you actually achieve those things, like completing Ride Across Britain, I mean, you feel this sense of pride and satisfaction that is just so thrilling and so rewarding that it was worth it. And I kind of look back at those very vivid moments that I remember absolutely clearly, when I thought, I don't know if I can keep doing this. I think I've hit my wall. And I managed. There were others. There were others on the ride, and we supported one another. There were 800 people, so when you saw someone struggling, you'd say, "Get on my wheel," because when you're cycling and someone's behind your airstream, it's easier for them. And I would do that to others. Others did it for me. That makes a big difference. Those little moments certainly helped. But resilience is really, I think it really is kind of the theme of our time, because I think that you hear a lot of people say that. I don't know how old are you?
I'm
going to put you on.
Gonna turn 29 in a few months.
You're 20. So does that makes you a kind of, are you a zillennial, they call it, a Gen Z millennial?
Maybe, I mean, close to that cusp, but I would say technically I'm a millennial.
Okay.
But yeah.
You get away. But, I hear people complain that millennials and Gen Zers are not resilient as employees. That's a pretty common line. I think we have about 100 people at Trint, and I think my team is pretty resilient. But I think there are moments when I've seen over building the company, when I've met people We've had people who are not resilient and who think that, oh, you're just such a fool. If I were doing this, it would all be perfect. And, that's part of being 25 or 30 sometimes when you have an older boss who messes up like I have. But resilience is about saying, oh, this isn't going the way it should. How can I help solve it?
Mm.
What is the solution? It's not about what's gone wrong. It's about fixing it and figuring out how to do it better and admitting what you don't know and getting help and all of those things. And I actually, in my company's team week, which is an annual event we do at the end of November, we bring everybody in from around the world. My talk to the company as CEO and founder this year was about sort of lessons in resilience I learned on my ride across Britain, and because it really does sort of pushing yourself and discovering you have more in you than you thought is applies to everything you do in life. Leaning on others for help, training and understanding what you can do to prepare yourself, getting the right resources before you embark. All of those are lessons for a marathon ride, and for work, for a challenge at work. So that was the topic of my keynote at our team week this year, and I
Mm.
put a lot of work into it, and I was very proud of it because I felt like in talking about sort of my own moments of despair and feelings of being overwhelmed and how I worked through them and ultimately got myself to the end of that ride. And when I hit John O'Groat, Scotland, which is the furthest north you can go, and cross the finish line, wow, it was great. What a feeling.
Wow. That's sensational. And I mean, I've participated in a sprint triathlon, which is, half the distance of an Olympic triathlon. And that felt to me like a challenge that I had to overcome. And I'm prepping right now for a marathon. So hearing the scale at which you're performing and competing is amazing. And I hope that over the course of my career I can, continue the habits and routines of staying fit, pursuing physical challenges. I know that, being a CEO and founder is super demanding, and I know that also being a reporter is really demanding. What kind of habits and behaviors throughout your career helped you maintain and continuously improve your fitness and, the interests in your life that are outside of your day-to-day work?
I would certainly say that I started cycling when road cycling seriously when I moved to London. I'd wanted to do it earlier in my life, but Miami, where I live, just isn't a great place. The roads aren't fantastic for road cycling, and there isn't the contours are it's flat land, so it's not that interesting. So when I moved here, I met someone who had done it, and he kind of showed me how to, you know, the basic kit I needed, and then I joined my local club in London, which is a community club. It's huge and it's really well organized, and that from other people learned. And when the weather's good here, sort of from March to late October, I'm out cycling 3-4 times a week after work, twice a week, and or before work on a Friday morning at 6 a.m., and then at least once and often twice on the weekend. And it's a really good way to decompress, to clear your brain, to just allow your body to uh, relieve stress. And to be honest, I would say one of the things I learned as a reporter and a war correspondent was I don't carry a lot of stress. I'm quite philosophical about the demands I'm under. I think that there have been moments in building this company when I have felt stressed. I'm not going to lie, but in day-to-day stuff, I don't stress, and I think it's because I learned as a reporter that the tougher things get, the calmer you've got to be, and carrying it as a personal burden doesn't allow you to think more clearly. It doesn't read well in the eyes of those looking to you for leadership. Well, okay, I have to tell you another story. Okay, story time again. Forgive
Yeah.
me. In 2004 in Haiti, when Jean-Bertrand Aristide, the president, was facing this revolution that ultimately overthrew him in a coup d'état, I interviewed Aristide in the presidential palace, this magnificent French colonial presidential palace in Port-au-Prince, and uh, I think it was on a Wednesday, and we George Stephanopoulos, who at the time was hosting This Week, the Sunday political show for ABC News, wanted to get Aristide on the show, and so because I had the contacts, I helped navigate it, and we got the confirmation. That Saturday night, we went to bed and got up very early to go down from our hotel in Pétionville, up in the mountains, to the presidential palace. And you have to understand that Port-au-Prince is a city that never sleeps. It's very poor. There are people walking and there are fires burning on the roadside, and it's just always chaotic. And I remember we got in our vehicle and the roads were deserted. And we said to each other, "What's going on?" And we get down to the presidential palace, and we have security with us. We have a cameraman, producer. I think we had a sound man, sound engineer, and a local driver. I don't remember. I think we might have had a second vehicle, and translator. And we got to the gate that we'd used a few days earlier, and there was a big chain with a big lock on it. And I went up to the very young soldier there, Haitian soldier, and I speak French, and I said, we have an interview with the president in a couple of hours, and we have to get in and set up. And he started sweating and said, no, pas possible. And I said, come on, man, we're here. It's all like, you can use my phone. And I couldn't figure out what was going on. And he just wasn't going to budge. And I don't think he had a key to that huge padlock. And I should say that the presidential palace was surrounded by huge concrete barriers, the kind of things that divide highways, to stop the guerrillas from smashing through the beautiful wrought iron fence that surrounded the palace. The only way in behind those barriers was a chicane, a zigzag, at the back by the service entrance to the palace. So we went back to the service entrance to try to get into the palace that way. And we rolled down our windows, and these guards looked at us, and they put their guns up to us and said, "Get the F out here." And in French, they said, "You're not welcome here." And I remember I got on my satellite phone, called Washington, and said, "I don't think we're getting this interview. Something's going on here." This was like 7 a.m. or something like that, and maybe earlier. But I think you better plan for plan B here. And we turned around to leave, to go through that chicane. And just as we did, there was gunfire. And I don't honestly think it was aimed at us, but it was coming from somewhere in the trees. And we didn't have a choice where to go, because to get out of that compound, we had to follow the zigzag. And I think it was one of the less flattering moments of my life. I think I panicked, and I said whatever I said. And I remember our private security guy sitting in the passenger seat up front, turning around saying, "Shut the fuck up. You're not helping." Wow. And I immediately realized I could never do that again. We were under life and death situation. We didn't know that it wasn't aimed at us, but there was gunfire, and we had every right to. We weren't in a bulletproof vehicle. We had, any reasonable person would assume that you just want to get away and be far from it. He and the driver had to make some very difficult decisions without context. And here I was in this senior position as a reporter with a team, and I was panicking. And I said to myself, "You can never, ever do that again." And I never have. I learned my lesson because I misbehaved, is the truth. It's not my proudest moment, but it was a good learning. So I think it was a good moment, because building a company, I remember when Silicon Valley Bank collapsed, last year, the year before, I was away skiing in France, and I got a text from my board chair saying, "Have you seen the news? Silicon Valley Bank's going under." And that was our bank in the U.S., although we're a UK-based company. Wow. Much of our business is in the U.S. And I skied down to the chalet that my friends and I had rented, and got online and spoke to my leadership team. And I remember my number two saying, "Jeff, I couldn't believe that you never panicked during all of that. You didn't once get anxious or raise your voice. And I said, you know, I've learned that it doesn't
Mhm.
help solve the problem. You just have to keep yourself anchored, focus on what is the problem? What knowledge do I have? What do I need to communicate? What can I do?
Mhm.
And I think that my response to that, which was nothing like having gunfire, to be clear,
Yeah.
but my response of calm was very much a learning from that experience in Port-au-Prince.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, you hear a lot about the importance of staying cool under pressure, but I think that that takes it to an extreme, and probably one of those things that until you experience something like that, it's probably really hard to apply that sentiment. So, I mean, it's really awesome to hear. Um, just a few things. One, I just want to like get a feel from you what your hard stop would be now, just so I can like time the rest of the questions.
We probably have, I think I have another 15 minutes.
All right, so I'll time us for 15. I think for the remainder of this conversation, I have a few questions that are a little bit more disjointed, so it might not feel like I'm responding to what you're saying, but I just really want to get your perspective on these. So, I'm curious, given your career, what your take is on the current state of media, and what we can expect in the future with the blowing up of independent journalism, podcasts, social media, and just other forms of content.
I think we need another episode to answer that question.
I see.
I think, wow, that's a big topic. Um,
Hmm.
I would say that democracy wasn't designed to withstand unfiltered social media, and I think that we, as a the Western world, is struggling to understand how to deal with the content, the unfiltered, often manufactured content that is filling Twitter, X, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, etc. And I think that it's a real challenge for democracy that when the public square is filled with hate, uninformed opinion, manufactured content that is just not true, it undermines our ability as citizens to know what to believe and to be informed in a way that allows us to make smart decisions. And I think that it's allowed for this kind of spiral of anger and hate to dominate the discourse in a way that isn't, it just isn't good. I can't imagine anyone rationally standing back and saying the kind of, if you're not, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, whether you like Trump or you don't like Trump, I think that it's hard to see someone saying the kind of polarization that we have, that is a result of this kind of discourse, is good for society. Politics is ultimately about how do we get along, and I don't think we're doing that very well right now. And I think the media has traditionally played a key role in helping people understand what's going on so they can understand how we can get along and how we need to do better. I think that that's lost in so much of the discourse today. And I think that, somebody after, I saw a post after the November 5th election talking about we need to reach the people beyond the paywall. And this person was talking about the New York Times paywall. The New York Times has something like 10 million subscribers. Well, that's great, and I'm one of them. But you have to accept that a lot of people in America are not reading the New York Times and aren't interested in reading the New York Times and don't want to be told to read the New York Times. And I think that when information comes from other places, and I'm not saying the New York Times is perfect, by the way. I'm not saying it should be your only source of information. But my point is that I think that a lot of people aren't getting any context in their information, and they're not looking for context, and they're I think that what's happening is that people are being allowed to come to conclusions and not challenged, but to think about the context and the veracity.
Hmm.
And I think it's a real threat to democracy. I think watch this channel. I don't know where it goes. I don't
Hmm.
know where it takes us.
Given, the responsibility of people who put content out there, put information out there, what is something that you would urge or encourage me as a creator, a podcaster, and maybe other people who are involved in the space in order to kind of justify the responsibility that we sometimes have when we just release information into the world?
Uh, that's the second episode after the one we do on the state of the media.
Mhm.
Um, I think these are big questions. I don't know that I can answer those kind of questions in a sentence or two,
Yeah.
but I think that talking to people who disagree with you, I think going to places you don't normally go, not looking for the cliches, uh, trying to understand why people are thinking so differently from you and letting them speak, not assuming that they're ill-informed you know, or worse. I think it's really important that we understand that there are big differences of what the fundamentals of society should be, and they are more exposed today than they have been in probably in modern times, certainly since the Second World War. And I think that uh, it is not absolutely clear that we know how to navigate that. So I think we need to talk to each other, listen to each other. I'm not sure that's enough. That's a bit of an apple pie response. I feel now that I've said that it's a bit of a cop out. I
Mm.
feel like I need to think about that one. It's just such a big question, and I don't have an off the cuff answer that's profound and deep and provocative the way I wish I did. But um, sorry about that.
Yeah, no. I mean, I'm sure it's definitely a loaded question, and I think what you responded, considering the time constraint, is insightful and useful. So, I mean, I appreciate it. Um, yeah, just to keep us honest with time, I'll stick to maybe two questions with substance and then one like brief one. I feel like there's a lot of common threads between journalism and entrepreneurship as far as listening, empathizing with customers and other people, being open to learning new things. From your perspective, what could entrepreneurs learn from journalists?
Huh. I think you're right, first of all. I was surprised how well journalism prepared me for entrepreneurship because certainly every news organization I've worked for, successful journalists come up with stories, research them, sell them to the desk. No successful journalist just sits there waiting for the phone call saying, "Go here, go do this, go do that." I don't know any reporters who are good reporters who live that way. Any curiosity is a fundamental ingredient, which we've talked about, and so you become incredibly entrepreneurial. When I went to Latin America for ABC News, when it wasn't breaking news stories like a revolution or an earthquake, uh, I came up with a whole list of stories, often a dozen stories and key characters. And I would work with a producer and we would then budget them. And then we would send them off to the story meetings at Good Morning America, ABC World News, Nightline, ABC News Radio. And they would come back and say, well, we'll take 3, we'll take 6. And if somebody else will pay for 7 with us, we'll put some money on that. And that's how I did it. And I did it for 10 years, going a couple of times a year for weeks at a time to do the most fascinating stories that my producer or maybe one of the editors in one of the programs came up with, and it was incredibly rewarding. It turns out that kind of hustle and that kind of conviction is really critical when you're building a tech company. It's not a lot different. I mean, this is just a longer journey for a single story.
Hmm.
So what could entrepreneurs learn from journalists? How to ask questions, how to listen, how to research, how to be informed. I think that all of those things are essential for. I'm moving away from my microphone again.
No worries.
All of those things are essential if you're going to be a successful entrepreneur and their fundamentals of journalism.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. And given that you're hiring people and I'm not saying right now they're hiring anyone, but like that part of your capacity as a CEO is hiring and recruiting. What does your background of pivoting into this career, how does that inform your approach to recruiting? Because I know that often jobs have certain requirements based on years of experience in a certain discipline, but oftentimes transferable skills are really valuable. And I would just wonder if you approach hiring from the perspective of, oh, I pivoted and I'm doing well. How might someone who comes from a non-traditional background fit within the company? Like, do you think in those terms at all?
Um, yes and no. I think that there is some room for that, but I think there also are fundamental skill sets that you need. And you need people who have experience. When you start early on and you have only a handful of employees and you have very little money, I hired smart young employees who, some fresh out of university, who didn't really know what they were doing, but they had enough self-awareness to know that, and they had enough curiosity and smarts to figure out how to find answers. And at the time, that was fine. They weren't perfect. I was far from perfect too, so we were a good marriage. But it got us through those early days. As a company matures from that storming to forming to norming, as they say, you need people who have been there and done that. And it's just a given. You can't have a digital marketer who's never done digital marketing, no
Mhm.
matter how smart he or she is. It just doesn't work. And I think then it becomes a question of, in roles, I think one of the things that happens in any company, but particularly a startup that becomes a scale up, a growth company, is that people who get you from A to B and B to C may not have the skill sets to get you from C to D.
Mhm.
And that's a really common challenge. A lot of those people will say, you know what, I've had my run, I'm moving on, thanks. And they've been good employees and they leave as good leavers. Some people like it, or they don't want to move, or they're afraid to move, and they need to move. And I think that's the hard part as a boss, is understanding that they've run out of ability to get us to the next place. And sometimes you have to encourage them to move on. And you hope that they'll find their own, they'll come to their own conclusion on that. But sometimes they don't. And sometimes you have to have some tough conversations. I think that in terms of taking risks with people, I know what you're saying. Yeah, unconventional backgrounds can be very useful, but you need to, it's role specific. And I
Mhm.
think you need to believe that they're going to do the job that needs to be done and they're going to bring added value. And particularly at the stage we're at, this is, I want everybody to learn, everybody to grow, everybody to be challenged. It would be an awfully dull world if that didn't happen at
Mhm.
work. But I also think that every new employee needs to add something new to the puzzle. And I would hope that that new employee would bring things that we don't already have.
Mhm. Yeah, makes sense, and I appreciate your perspective. And I mean, similar to a lot of these themes, I can probably go on forever asking you and learning more from your perspective on these. So, just as a closing question, considering this show's focus, so Rhizomes podcast focus on adapting to change and pivoting, and growing in new environments. Do you have any parting words that you would hope to leave the audience with?
So I think one of the challenges of growing older and hitting 50 is that if you've had a successful career as an employee, you probably got a good title, a reasonable salary if you're a white collar worker. Uh, and you may find that your ability to rise up or to hold that job is starts to diminish at some point. You can call it ageism, but the reality is you get expensive, and uh, you've been there some time, and there's always a push to bring in fresh and new and young. And so I think that I see it amongst so many of my contemporaries, my friends and colleagues, where you suddenly feel like, you know you're blocking you're perceived as a blocker to someone else, the advance of others, and it's not a very nice place to be. And I think that what I inadvertently discovered is that reinventing life and your career is a really fantastic thing if you can figure out how to pull it off and not be afraid. Um, I didn't really know I was setting out to do this when I stumbled into building Trint, but it turns out it's been a it's like it's rejuvenating in the sense that uh, it's so difficult, so challenging, so all full on that I haven't had the luxury of coasting to retirement.
Mm.
It just hasn't been like that for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And I'm really happy about that, by the way. Most of my employees are half my age. I love working with our team. I think they're just great people. They bring a huge amount of skill and passion to work, and it's fun. Um, and I am really proud that I've helped shape their careers. And in some cases, uh, they've followed up with me and said that it was really formative in helping them launch their careers or pivot their careers into a direction that they didn't know they were going. And so I think that just because you've done something for a long time and you've loved it as I did doesn't mean you need to do it till you die. That's
Mhm.
what I learned in pivoting.
Yeah. Wow. Those are amazing words to close off with, and I really appreciate it. And it sounds like you're a great employer as far as just how much you care about your employees. So that's awesome. What's a good way for people to keep up with your work, whether it's at Trint or otherwise?
Um, geez, you can find Trint on Facebook. You can find me on LinkedIn. I think you can also find Trint on Instagram and TikTok. Um, and you can reach me. My email's it's out there. It's jeff@trint.com. Jeff with a J.
Cool. Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for your time. It was such an honor to speak with you and learn about your experiences. I could probably keep asking you a bunch of questions forever, but I'm glad I got the opportunity to pick your brain for a few hours.
I will say this, and I don't say it lightly. You you asked some really good questions that I've never been asked before, and I love that.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah. Coming from you, it means a lot to hear that. So I appreciate it.
All right, thanks.
Cool.